And joining us now to weigh in is 32 Advisors CEO Robert Wolf. Robert, it's good to see you.
Great to see you.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Great interview.
Thank you. We're having a discussion on tax reform today. How do you see it?
Well, I think he is a bit idealistic. I think he's a bit hopeful. I don't think it's going to be so easy at all. I think that tax adjustment is not going to happen.
The border adjustment?
Yeah, it just is not going to happen. We live in a consumer-driven country. It will be deemed much too protectionist, especially you'll see retailers just lobby that until there's no tomorrow. Steve may have a different view on that.
No, we just talked about that. I think Steve agrees with that.
And then I think it's just really hard. I think we'll see a tax cut. I just don't see tax reform happening. And if we do, they should just focus on business tax reform. They are not going to get business and personal done this year.
So you would prioritize or think to prioritize corporate rates over individual rates?
Yes, I think that business tax reform, if you include small business, it can drive, first of all, it will drive the repatriation back. Secondly, I think it's just easier. You'll get Democrats and Republicans. Everyone wants business tax reform. I agree with Brady. People want a simplified approach and process. We should not be the highest tax country in the world. And getting trillions back on a repatriation is important. When you start getting into personal tax cuts, that's a whole different thing with charity and mortgages. I mean, you'll just see it's just a different debate. Idealistically speaking, if we could have every senator get in line, put taxes at 20%, have an up and down vote on every loophole we have, you would not get them in line. So that's how tough it is. It's just too difficult.
Well, there's a lot of deductions, and every deduction has another lobbying group, right?
Yeah. And a committee chair.
So what's possible? What's possible?
Subcommittee chair. We have 800 subcommittees in Congress. Everyone has to be a chairman of the committee.
But see, this is what the markets are worried about today.
Absolutely.
And this will continue every day until the markets believe that there is some compromise or some common ground as it relates to tax reform, Lee.
Yeah, I think that there's no way that people have confidence unless we see something get done. And on one hand, you're hearing some folks say you're going to have to go small. Like you're saying, let's just carve out corporate taxes. Others saying we have to do it all or else we're not going to. And then the other thing is who is going to negotiate right now with Donald Trump? Is he going to get with the Freedom Caucus on his side, or is he going to get more likely Democrats to go with him?
You make a really good point, because I think now, someone said this yesterday on Sunday Morning Futures, when Paul Ryan walks in the room and says, hey, I have a really good idea, it's called the border adjustment tax. What kind of an audience is he going to have, especially after what just took place in health care, Steve?
Yeah, and so if they drop this border adjustment tax, 20% sales tax, they can get a bill through. But they also have to pass a personal tax cut, because just to do something for business, even though it's great for the economy, bad politics. So on the personal side, they're not going to have a massive reform. They're just going to swallow hard, do a rate cut, raise the deductions so everyone can feel it in the next paycheck, and make it retroactive to Jan 1 and clean the code another day. But they got to get a cut through.
Do you think it's going to happen?
Easy, Robert. This sounds easy.
Listen, as Maria knows and Steve and I have talked about it, you know, I looked at 8 years as President Obama's advisor on tax reform. Both sides wanted it. To do things revenue neutral, near impossible.
Forget it.
Okay, so therefore you have to get the deficit hawks to be able to take that step forward. Incredibly hard. It just is really hard. I remember it wasn't at 20% or 15 like Trump and Ryan, but when President Obama wanted it at 25%, the minute it had to be revenue neutral, you couldn't get things passed through committee.
Why hang yourself up on revenue neutrality? These 10-year projections aren't worth the paper they're printed on. And why don't you just plug in 4% growth? By golly, that gets you a lot of revenue.
Would you?
Instead of these
when do you think that happens? 4% growth.
You could have it next year after 10 years of 2%.
You think 4% in 2018?
You could get it.
How do you get that?
By having the right kind of tax cuts.
And the rollback of regs.
I'm old enough to remember in the early 80s, when after the terrible 82 recession, Marty Feldstein and others were saying, oh, we're going to have a long period of slow growth. By golly, you got the taxes right, the money right, the economy grew 7%.
Here are the three things that the Journal is saying is going to be the big sticking points for the Republicans. Number one, competing desires to cut tax rates sharply and slow the rise of the national debt. Number two, who are you trying to make happy? Individuals or the top 1%? the middle of the country or the top. And number 3, the border adjustment tax. These are the 3 things that the Journal points out today are going to be the most pressing.
You know, Steve and I have had this debate, Maria. You actually were the moderator.
I remember.
It was like 1 against 4, so it was a little even.
That was a lot of fun.
But what I would say is it's the whole debate. And listen, Steve is a very supply-side driven. Has a very supply-side driven perspective, pro-growth.
He calls it pro-growth. Thank you so much.
Very Reaganomics perspective. I'm a Reagan Democrat. Listen, if you're brought up in the 80s on Wall Street, you're a Reagan Democrat. That being said, this isn't the 80s. Rates are not at 20%. Okay, you know, the U.S. was everything. China was de minimis back then. Russia was de minimis. It's totally different today. We live in a different country, and it's a different world. I just think the idea of trickle-down economics and comparing it to the 80s is not the same today. And so Steve and I have a respectful debate, but I just think that supply-side perspective I don't think will work.
Part of the reason, though, this is different is because this time with the tax plan, the White House is driving it. Do you disagree with that? I mean, it's really Steven Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, and Gary Cohn driving tax reform, whereas on the health care bill, it was Paul Ryan and company driving it.
Although the Republicans do have the blueprint that has some of those concepts baked into it. But that's what border adjustment tax is. It's articulated in the blueprint.
That's right. The
I
GOP
would
blueprint.
be surprised that Gary Cohn and Steven Mnuchin, more on the moderate side, for a border adjustment tax.
I don't think they are.
Okay,
No.
I mean, so...
Yeah.
No.
So if they get rid of the border adjustment tax, then they can get a plan through.
I think you can get... I think you can get a business. I think, you know, Steve and I has a little disagreement. When you take all of tax, to say that you're going to start that in the spring is just very difficult to see all the fits and starts. Why not get a huge win under your belt? We have not had business tax reform done in God knows how long. We have trillions of dollars overseas stuck there. Let's figure that out. That is bipartisan. I think when you get into personal, to Lee's point, you get into the 1% versus the middle class. It's just a different debate.
One challenge, though, is so many small businesses are owned, not to be the accountant in the room, by LLCs.
But you are.
I am the accountant in the room. But they're owned by LLCs, which don't pay tax at that level, so you have to give them some relief in personal tax.
And that's what happened with Obamacare.
Yeah.
It hit small business owners, the individual rate.
Well, I would include small business.
Right.
As of someone who has my company's at LLC, I wish we could include those as well. Listen, there's amendments you can look at.
Right.
I just think this overhaul is tough. And then, you know, Maria and I were speaking recently, you know, you have the debt ceiling. Okay, that comes up soon.
Yeah.
That has to be smooth ride. That has to be smooth sailing. That cannot be one of these huge debates that gets us off track on getting tax reform done starting in the spring.
All right.
So,
Lots to talk